Go ahead.
Good afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to cover a very difficult president. He was only president for 4 years. He's our 11th president. His name is President Polk. Polk was very much involved in the slave business. He owned a huge plantation in Mississippi. He himself did not live on that plantation. And so he spent a lot of time trying to staff it and to make money, and he did. So you have this commitment, again, by another president that continues the argument about slavery. And the argument is getting hot and heavy because the country is growing by leaps and bounds. And as the country grows, the question is, how many slave states will come in as opposed to how many free states will come in? The idea is to balance it. So if you have one free state come in, let's say Indiana, then you have to have a slave state come in, let's say Louisiana. Better yet, since you're going to run out of southern states soon, and there are many other states, territories that are waiting to become states, that you have to have a pocket full of miracles waiting. And that pocket appears in the size of the huge territory that is Mexican, that is known as the Mexican Texas territory. And people have been moving into Texas illegally for some time. So there's a movement in Texas itself for Texas to be independent of Mexico. And there is a movement in the United States for it to then suddenly be a US state divided into 10 little states. So let's say you have the state of Houston, the state of Galveston, the state of San Antonio, the state of Dallas, the state of El Paso, the state of Austin, on until you get 10 little states, all of which can be slave states. And therefore, you let one of them in, then you let a free state in, and another one in, and another free state. And so it goes until you run out of states, you think. So Polk is one of those people who's very interested in keeping this so-called balance, the balance of free states as opposed and along with slave states. And this poses a number of problems. Number one, it's not ours, it's Mexico's. So number two, maybe they could break away. Maybe we could encourage them to revolt. And then maybe we could take them over. And so the Mexicans are watching carefully, and we're watching carefully. And our great problem is the fact that we keep calling the place empty, that the continent that is North America, other than those crazy Canadians, it's empty. And it's not empty. That's the problem. It's full of people known as Indians. And they don't think they're empty, but they live in a very extensive way across the landscape. They do not farm it. They do not look at it as an intensive piece of territory. They would never have in their local languages, be it Iroquois or Mohawk, Shawnee, Apache, a word for a poem like Robert Frost would have in saying that a series of gates, a series of walls make for good neighbors. No, it doesn't. They don't have to have any walls. They don't live in the land the way we do. And therefore we refuse to see them there, and we call it empty. And we make sure it's empty as soon as we can. Let me give you two tragic examples. One, I always like to pick on New England. So there is a wonderful area called Rhode Island. We have someone here working in the dining room who's from Rhode Island. He's very proud of it. And there is in Rhode Island a wonderful bay, the Narragansett. And the bay is so beautiful that the Navy put its war college there. And not only the Navy, but the Vanderbilts and other rich plutocrats from the Northeast built fabulous homes, summer homes, cottages, they call them, something on the order of the Breakers with its 27 bedrooms that they called a cottage. And so how are you going to get that in there if you're going to have these Narragansett Indians? Well, you have a little war, King Philip's War, and you kill all the Indians. And now you don't have a problem anymore because there aren't any Indians. So you wipe out the Indians there. And in my home state of Virginia, where we had the wonderful Powhatan, who was a chief of the Kickadan Indians, and he had a daughter who married an Englishman and went back to see people at the court of St. James. Her name was Pocahontas. You've heard of her recently because there's a senator from New England who some politicians are calling Pocahontas. Well, the Virginians got rid of those Indians. So there aren't any Indians left. And so the countryside was settled by people who used the land intensively, whereas the Indians referred to the land as their mother, and they used it extensively. They didn't crop it. They took what they had from it, and they captured what they needed, like wild turkeys and the rest, and had a life that they lived there. So the country was never empty. It's just empty in the eyes of Anglo-Saxons who wanted these people out of the way. Now, the worst crime of all was with the Cherokee Indians and their removal. By this time, a ruthless American was in fact president of the United States. His name was Andrew Jackson. And Jackson was very much in favor of Indian removal. He admitted they were there. He just wanted them to go away. He had driven the Seminole Indians into the swamps of the Everglades. And now he took the Cherokee Nation, a nation that had done everything it could to look like and be like the Americans. It had written a constitution in their language, like our Constitution, had built many institutions like ours so they could live in peace with us. Nevertheless, we ordered them to leave Georgia and go on their long trail of tears all the way to the Oklahoma Territory. Now, it's too bad, but it always happens. There's a Frenchman traveling in our country at the time. He writes the greatest book about us that's ever been written. The book is called Democracy in America, 2 volumes. He greatly admires us. And he happens to be at the Mississippi River when the Cherokee Indians, in this long and torturous and quite deadly journey in the wintertime, cross the Mississippi to their new, quote, home in the Oklahoma Territory. And he sees it for what it is, ethnic cleansing. You've heard the term before. We use it to castigate other people, but that's exactly what we did. We ethnically cleaned the Northeast, and then the Mid-Atlantic, and then the South. And we did so with a presidential policy. Now, I have some friends who used to live in Rhode Island. They're very nice people. They now live in Florida. They're the O'Briens. And they would never do anything like this. But the people before them did that. And even in Virginia, where I grew up, we had all kinds of names. Kickahan Road for the Kickahan Indians, Cherokee Road for the Cherokee Indians. But they were just road signs now because all the Indians were gone. I even played an Indian in an outdoor drama. Paul Green wrote The Founders, which was a story of the founding at Jamestown in 1607. And we had someone playing Pocahontas, and Pocahontas gets to marry John Rolfe and get to go to England. So you see, at the beginning, it looked like it was going to work, and in the end, it didn't work, and we simply got rid of the Indians. Ethnic cleansing, American style. The land was never, ever empty. And it wasn't empty even when we crossed the Mississippi, when, in fact, Jefferson sent his two Virginia friends, Lewis and Clark, on their long expedition to search through and look at the territory Jefferson had bought from Napoleon, the Louisiana Purchase. They came across all kinds of Indians out in Dakota and in Montana. And they knew these Indians were there. They knew it wasn't empty land. In fact, Jefferson told these two men to speak to the Indians about him, Jefferson, being their great white father, and welcoming them into this community, the new community of the United States. What a welcome that was. Soon they'd be off to the reservations. And if they didn't want to go, they got killed. Very easy. Tragic story of the Indian removal policy, starting particularly with Andrew Jackson, but having been a policy for a long time of lots of people, even in colonial days. It's interesting that in the New England states, they bemoan the tragedy of the Indian people without knowing that they're part of the tragic history and the cause of that tragic history. Now, this all leads us back again to Texas. What to do? Americans are now streaming across the mountains. They have gone into the Ohio Valley. They've gone up the Mississippi River. They are out there on the edge looking for new lands. We have a definition of ourselves. We call it our manifest destiny. And that manifest destiny is to go all the way to the Pacific. Now, manifest destiny is simply an explanation for our colonial imperialism. We were going to make this land our land, and we were going to make it one way or the other. We'll buy it if we can, and we certainly did with Jefferson. And then we will negotiate because we don't want to mess with the Canadians. We've already messed with them twice, and they beat us up. So we'll negotiate the Oregon Territory. But when it comes to Texas, it looks like we could beat up the Mexicans. And it looks like a lot of Americans have already moved into Texas. And it looks like some of the people in Texas want to get out of Texas. So how to do that? Well, you can encourage the Texans to revolt. And then when they've revolted, you can invite them in. Or if that's not good enough, what you can do is actually go in and take it. And as fate always does, things seem to happen. We have in American history a number of big folk heroes. All people have folk heroes. Usually the heroics are not really heroic, and the folk are really not folk you'd really want to know. Nevertheless, we have them in this struggle for Texas. And the Mexicans have their side also. There's a Mexican general, Santa Anna. His very strong views about the incursions of these Americans. And there's a fortified position that lives on in American history. And quite a few numbers of famous Americans die in the attack on the Alamo. And it's quite clear that Santa Anna was also a believer in take no prisoners. So in fact, when the Alamo was attacked, two folk heroes happened to be inside at the time. One of the folk heroes was Davy Crockett. Another folk hero was Jim Bowie of the famous Bowie knife. And these guys die in the siege at the Alamo. Now, the problem with the story of the Alamo and its siege, and finally the killing of all the Americans inside, is quite easily told. It's a story about the takeover, and unfortunately, Like all folk heroes, you don't really think that Robin Hood lived in the Sherwood Forest, do you? Or you don't think that those three musketeers, one for all and all for one, really ran around the kingdom of France, tricking the Cardinal Richelieu? These are stories that were told, folk tales, and they're wonderful. Problem is they are easily made into films. So we've had a number of very famous films of the Three Musketeers and also of Robin Hood. And so we've had tales of the guys at the Alamo. We don't do a very good job in telling those tales because we turn it over to Hollywood. And in Hollywood, there's always someone who thinks that John Wayne would be the great star. So you have John Wayne starring as Davy Crockett. Well, that has distorted the tale of Davy Crockett for all time. But we got it. Now, you shouldn't be too hard on John Wayne. When he is in the hands of a competent director like John Ford, when they're making great movies like the one that was made with Montgomery Clift on the great cattle movement of a large number of Texas Longhorns and others to market, it's a very good movie. Because what John Ford does, he realizes that John Wayne is larger than life. You put him in a horse and he's even larger. So you need to put him in the middle of 50,000 head of cattle, or better yet, you need him to take him to a place in America that is so overwhelmingly beautiful that you don't look at John Wayne or pay any attention to him. Like Monument Valley, which is the most incredible place I've ever seen in the United States. Unbelievably beautiful. But when you take him and put him in the Alamo, you don't have history. You have folklore badly told. And so this is what happened to poor old Davy Crockett. He was not only taken up by John Wayne, before that, he was taken up by Fez Parker. He was a TV personality. So you have the struggle. The people in Washington under Polk, who approves very much of Indian removal, which, by the way, David Crockett was very much opposed against and fought by being in the Congress of the United States against this president of the United States and his policies to remove the Indians, move them until they finally would disappear, hopefully, go away. And so it was that war came. It was first a rebellion by the Texans, led by the Americans who had moved into Texas without permission, then led by Polk's assortment of people he sent forward. He actually had an ambassador in Mexico City that he would try to fire, but before he could fire them, we had landed at Veracruz, and from Veracruz on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, we'd marched up to Mexico City, and we'd taken Mexico City. And in all of this, it's interesting for Americans to know this was the rehearsal war for your own Civil War. Because in the Mexican War, young lieutenants like Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and an assortment of others got their first experience of real battle. In the process of this land grab, we forced the Mexicans to sign a treaty the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848. And we forced them to cede all of the Southwest. Suddenly it just wasn't Texas. My God, if we could get Texas, maybe we could even get that funny state called California. And we did. And everything in between, New Mexico, Arizona. We got it all, the American Southwest, by conquest, not by purchase. We purchased Florida from Spain. We purchased Louisiana from Napoleon. We negotiated the Oregon with Great Britain through Canada. In the case of Mexico, we simply land grabbed. I go to Mexico a lot because I like it. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. I love the Yucatan and all the Mayan ruins. I love Mexico City. Right now we have a wonderful exhibit at our De Young Museum of a wonderful Mexican woman, Frida Kahlo. And there's another town I love in Mexico. It's a city. It's Guadalajara. A very good friend of mine teaches there. He is an excellent professor at this most excellent university, Arturo Santa Cruz. And when I've gone down there to lecture, I've enjoyed very much the ambience of this part of Mexico, its openness, its friendliness. Why in the world we would put up a wall to keep them out is beyond me. At Guadalajara, one time when I was down, there was a book fair. Guadalajara has a very, very large and important book fair. And I heard that one of my favorite Mexican novelists, Carlos Fuentes, was there. So I went searching for him, and lo and behold, I found him. So in my high school Spanish, I said hello. He immediately spoke much better English than I spoke Spanish. And I told him about the large number of people in California in particular, Alta California, that's us, who spoke Spanish. In fact, how Spanish was becoming the language. There were places in Los Angeles where in the barrio, English disappears altogether. If you can't speak Spanish, you can't get out. And he said, yes, he knew about this. Also, he knew about Old Town in San Diego, which had recreated the San Diego when it was Mexican. He even knew about San Francisco and the Mission District. Unlike us, who are ahistorical, the Mexicans are very historical, particularly about what used to be theirs. And this increase in the number of people who speak Spanish, there was even a film at that time, A Day That Mexicans Didn't Come to Work was the theme. And now California simply stopped working because there was no one there to take care of the children, no one there to do the housework, no one there to do the yard work, no one there to do the work. Everyone was off in their air-conditioned offices getting Mexicans to do the basic work of living. And so whether it's Artemio Cruz, this wonderful novel by Carlos Fuentes, or the poetry of Octavio Paz, this contribution that the Mexicans have made, they're wonderful muralists, not only Frida Kahlo as an artist, but her lover, who did many pieces here in California, in San Francisco. We have several of them, large pieces that are in now the outer areas of the San Francisco Modern Museum. So it was that the war came, the war went, and we took these very large properties for ours and quickly made them states. Because what we had during this time, even when Polk was president, this is hard for you to believe, I know, given the election. By the way, I'm wearing my I voted badge for you to see today. In the days when Polk was president, there was no Republican Party, none at all. What there was a great Whig Party. And Polk had actually won against a Kentucky guy who was the Whig candidate for president. And there were all kinds of small parties in this country vying for a position. There was the Free Soil Party, and their only platform was no slavery in my state. There's a very special party, special in my heart. It was a party that only had one platform: no Irish. That's right. They call themselves the Know Nothings, the Know Nothing Party, the Free Soil Party, the Whig Party, which split into two: the Northern Whigs, who were anti-slavery, and the Southern Whigs, who were pro-slavery. Conscience Whigs and those who felt they had to protect the peculiar institution, this institution that the President of the United States was very much involved in protecting and adding to. Because by now, France and Britain had both declared the slave trade illegal, and they stopped slavery from operating. And so you could not get slaves any longer from Africa. But you had enough slaves in the Upper South, particularly in Virginia, that you could breed slaves, just like you bred other animals. And then you could take and sell their children into slavery. And so slavery continued to grow in the Southern colonies, now states, soon to be the Confederacy. And so it was difficult at best. And in the process, the country was changing rapidly. One little thing changed things for all time. Eli Whitney was an inventor. He messed around with lots of things. There had been tales told by Englishmen of many, many millennia ago, back in Mughal India. The Indians had grown cotton, and they had a machine, a piece of inventive device that they used to be able to get the difficult problem of getting the cotton away from the kernel, the little prickly part that was in the bed of any of the cotton. And in their case, they raised a long, stable cotton, which was easy enough to do. The problem in the American South, given the kind of territory we were going to grow cotton on, which was the Deep South, we're talking South Carolina, South, Georgia, across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. That was a very short, stable cotton. It was very, very difficult to separate. And so cotton remained fairly dormant, given the difficulty of separating it, until Eli Whitney invented a special cotton gin that did, in fact, work against the short, stable cotton of the American South. And then the world was their oyster. They could organize these huge plantations, and money, much of the money from the North The best investment in the world in 1810, again in 1820, again in 1830, was in cotton lands in the South. You got to get a high return on your investment. So lots of money from New York, Pennsylvania, poured into southern cotton lands, opening lands not even turned over to cotton yet, and up the Mississippi, all the way up to Memphis. Cotton was king. Now, there was a difference in the cotton lands and the cotton people. There is off the coast of South Carolina, but more specifically off the coast of Georgia, a series of sea islands. I have an aunt who lives on one of them. She lives on St. Simon's Island. It's a very beautiful place. It's where Southerners like to go in the hot, unbearable summers of the deep South before air conditioning. Because here on the sea islands, you always had a sea breeze, and you could sit on these big verandas and look out to sea. And on these sea islands, they grew a very special cotton. It's the kind of cotton you can get in Egypt today from its huge cotton crops. The cotton crops in Egypt go almost immediately at high price to Paris, to little shops called Chanel, Givenchy. These are fashion houses that take this long, stable cotton and weave it. And so it comes to you in a very different feeling. It's very smooth. It's like silk. It breathes, but it's not the short, stable cotton. And it requires lots of manual labor, not the picking so much, the turning of the soil, the constant movement so that you get the right ingredients to get the crop to grow and expand. And this did happen in America in one place, on the Sea Islands, and one group of African American slaves. They, unlike the large plantations, did not get destroyed in the process of family life. They continued to live as family units, and they continued to keep their own language, Gullah. Gullah is a language that comes from the Yoruba people of the West African areas near the Congo Basin. And these people have been studied in great detail. One, because their religion, their language, their customs all remained alive and well in the Deep South, which in fact did not happen with the other slave communities because they were torn apart constantly, sold and resold, families split up, traditions gone, language disappeared. So you have some groups and some very important and very luxurious cotton, but it's not the cotton that grows in Gone with the Wind, with Vivian Leigh out there in the yard working to save the crop. That's the cotton short stable, and the cotton gin of Eli Whitney is going to save that crop and make it the big export crop. In the 1810, 1820, 1830 period, cotton is the leading export of the United States of America. The British and the French can't get enough of it. The British mills, which are now starting the English Industrial Revolution, are turning out very cheap textiles. And they're doing it off the backs of American slaves. And American presidents are helping. Presidents like Polk, who invested much of his money and his fortune in a huge Mississippi plantation. Now you're talking about plantations with thousands of slaves. You have to remember when you talk about the South that you want to know something about it before you open your mouth. Less than 10% of the population of the South owned slaves. Less than 1% of the population owned 100 or more slaves. So the slavocracy, as it was called, is a minute part of the Southern population, but a powerful and influential. Obviously, it's had a number of presidents who were slave owners, small plantations. Mount Vernon is hardly even within the question. And on top of that, cotton doesn't grow in Virginia. Jefferson has slaves up at Mount Vernon, and at the other plantation he inherited from his wife. But again, he's more interested in growing better varieties of wheat. Monroe has plantation home very near Jefferson's, as does Madison. Madison's home is Montpelier. Dolly Madison lives there after he dies, but they have house servants, not field hands. In fact, the big crop that you can grow in Virginia for export is tobacco. The same for North Carolina. Speaking of North Carolina, Polk went to university in North Carolina. He's the only president I know who is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He also became a lawyer, and he only served 4 years, but they were tumultuous years of growth, because not only was this Texas going to be maybe 10 little states, all slave states, but you were going to have this huge expansion. Because remember, everybody was dealing with the fallacy that the land was empty. And you were going to get there in many ways. You're going to get the first railroad of any notice. This is not the Union Pacific. That's after the Civil War. This is the Baltimore and Ohio. You're going to be able to get from the Ohio River Basin all the way to Chesapeake Bay by a railroad that will take passengers and goods. You have this guy, Fulton, and he's decided that steam can drive lots of things, to include a paddle wheeling ship. And so you have these paddle wheelers going up the Hudson River. And once you get that little Erie Canal dug, you can get all the way from New York City, use the Hudson, then turn onto the Erie Canal, then turn onto the Great Lakes, and then be in Chicago. All this is going to speed up the process of change, make it possible for people to move into this territory, exploit the territory, use it intensively, not extensively, get rid of the Indians, drive them across the Mississippi, then drive them into the Dakotas, then find out that sometimes you couldn't drive them, like Little Bighorn and General Custer. Sometimes they fought back. But it did go on, and it went on, and up and down the Mississippi now. Here was a highway. In the old days, if you lived up on the, say, Ohio River, which has lots of forest, you can cut down the forest, drag the logs down, make a barge out of the logs, and take the logs down the Ohio to the Mississippi, and down the Mississippi to the big towns, Memphis, or maybe New Orleans itself, then sell the logs. But then it was a long way home. You really had to buy a horse and then ride it back. And there were famous trails that you could use. They were former Indian trails. Now they're trails for merchants selling lumber, coming down the great rivers, Missouri later, the Ohio now, and then the Mississippi itself. A wonderful trip. And you have a woman who comes into the scene. She's a wonderful writer. She is Jewish. She's from the Michigan area. She experiences terrible anti-Semitism in Michigan. But she writes like an angel. She wrote a book that later became a big movie with 2 movie stars, Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, and then 1 actor, James Dean. It's called Giant. She hardly knew Texas, but now Texas has been a state for a while. And so she puts a movie there, or really puts her book there. Later it's sold to the movies. She then was fascinated by the fact that Fulton's steamboats were coming down the river and going back up the river. So now you didn't have to ride a horse. You could come down the river with some goods, sell the goods, and then ride the steamboat back up the river. And many of these were interesting boats because they went from small town to mid-sized town to big town to small to mid-sized to small, up and down the river. So she wrote a book about one of them called Showboat. And there was a guy in New York, and he was looking for writing a Broadway music drama, not a Follies type of drama, nothing like that. They wanted just simply to write a type of serious music drama. And so he contacted her name. She's Edna Ferber, by the way. And Ferber says, no, she wasn't interested in the Ziegfeld Follies. He said, no, I'm not doing Ziegfeld Follies. I'm going to use your book to tell a wonderful story. And I'm going to use it exactly as you wrote it. He made these many promises, and so he did. And it became a huge hit. Made a megastar out of a great woman in New York theater, Helen Morgan. It has a song in it that is very reminiscent of all the problems that we were facing as a country. The song is Old Man River. It was sung by a great African American, both on the stage in New York and later when Louis B. Mayer decided to make it into a big splashy film. It was the typical sad story. Lena Horne was then under contract at Metro. Magnificent actress, singing actress. She begged Louis B. Mayer for the part of the woman who was half a black and half a white. But Louis himself, being Jewish, feared greatly the reaction of white racists, because suddenly on the screen would be an obvious black woman, and she would be having an affair with a white man. So he looked around the back lot at Metro, and there was a gorgeous woman. There were lots of gorgeous women at Metro, at MGM. And he chose this North Carolina gal from the tobacco fields, better known as Ava Gardner. And you could imagine that Ava Gardner could in fact have African-American blood. Many people in the American South did. We had a whole slave code to explain it to ourselves. You could be a quadroon. You could be an octoroon. This meant how many times over you had black blood. We know, for instance, that Jefferson did, in fact. First, he was married to a woman, Martha. They had 6 children. She died, some say to get away from Tom. He then had an affair with a British woman while he was on a legation in Paris. She didn't want to come to the colonies where there were Indians. And there were Indians very near Charlottesville in Jefferson's day. So he came back and he started an affair with Sally Hemings and had a number of children with Sally. Now, we know a lot about Sally because Sally's mother, first her grandmother was raped by a white overseer. So that meant that Sally's mother was half white and half black. And then Sally's mother was raped by another overseer. And that meant that Sally was 3/4 white and 1/4 black. And it meant that the Jefferson children that she had were becoming more and more white and less black. And so the code in the Old South said that if you were only 1/16 black, you were legally white. And so it was that we lived with these odd arrangements between people. We never knew these stories until many decades after Sally was dead. And Jefferson was certainly dead. That one of the Hemings children sued the Jefferson Historical Society because he wanted to be buried in the Jefferson family burial grounds on the grounds of the Jefferson home. And it caused a furor. The Jefferson lecturer, he had the Jefferson chair at the University of Virginia at Charlottesville, said it couldn't be true. Jefferson would have not had an affair with a black woman. Well, the professor was wrong. And we have the knowledge of that because that little problem we have called DNA quickly let us know that Thomas Jefferson had a number of children with Sally Hemings. And he memorized them all. Memorize was to make you free. It was quite customary in the South to have favorites among the slaves and to set them free. They were referred to as free men and women of color. They almost always went to the Atlantic or Gulf of Mexico, the seaboard. They went to Norfolk, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia. They went along the coasts all the way to Galveston, certainly to New Orleans. Some of the most beautiful women you ever saw in your life were these people of mixed heritage in New Orleans society. Strange, we Americans. But that wasn't Polk's problem. Polk's problem was to get Texas into the Union, split it up into 10 little states, and go on running his Mississippi plantation. Little did Polk know, and he should have known, he was university educated, lawyer, that his time was limited. That soon the tests would not hold, and people would, in fact, demand their freedom. I told you last time, but it's worth repeating, that already in Virginia in the 1830s, there was a slave rebellion. The story of that slave rebellion is written up in a very beautiful book, Nat Turner. Of course, he was put down, but not after he killed a number of white people, and white people killed a large number of black people. The book about Nat Turner is written by a famous Virginian who also wrote a beautiful book that is extremely sad. It's a Holocaust book, and I don't know why this Virginian felt called upon to put himself in the middle of that horror. But it's also a famous film. It's called Sophie's Choice. That's a book and a film that will break your heart. But this is all before our 11th president, in all his wisdom, encouraging the belief that the country, the landscape is empty, fill it up with people, go all the way out there to that funny place called California. Settle it peacefully if possible, because the British are watching us. So settle the Oregon Territory. In the case of Texas and Mexico, just go to war. Land the Marines at Veracruz. March from Veracruz up to Mexico City. Take the Mexican capital. Force upon them an unequal treaty. Today, we believe that it's illegal to do that. That if you conquer another state in war, you may not take their land away. They may pay an indemnity, but they may not take it away. But we were very lucky in these days. Number one, the last of the Virginia dynasty, Monroe, had issued a very famous doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine. We don't want any of you Europeans coming to Central or South or North America. We don't want you over here. It's the Monroe Doctrine. There was nothing to enforce that doctrine. No one was going to pay any attention to it. The British Navy decided it would be a good doctrine for us to enforce, us, the British, because then, with the British blocking any other European adventures, we, the British, could then run an informal empire in Central and South America, and they did. They built, with British money, British technology, the entire Argentine railroad system. And they ran it, and they made money from it. Finally, after World War I, their debts being so high, they had to sell it. But for a long time, we issued these declarations without any ability to enforce them. Don't tread on us. It was a strange time, but we got through it. The Indians were finally removed. To show us their deep and abiding sadness in your own lifetime, they came here to San Francisco Bay and took over Alcatraz, letting you know they were still here, still putting up a ruckus, but a little late in the day. Now I'm going to stop about here because I have something to announce. Next week, instead of doing another war with another president, I have spent much of my career at Berkeley leading Cal alumni trips around the world, across Asia, across South America, across Central America, across the United States, across Canada, across Russia, India, Ceylon, Burma, wherever. But I've had the best times, I think, when I led, and there are 100 of them that I led, on safaris across Africa. So I have a film that I am going to show you while I sit here and narrate parts of it. I'll take you to Zambia. Why Zambia? Because there is one of the most beautiful waterfalls in the world. It's not built up like Niagara Falls. It's called Victoria Falls. And in Victoria, you can ride a helicopter down the face of the falls, around the falls, on top of the falls, through the spray. And then you can go on the Zambezi River, up country. And then you can cut into one of the most marvelous countries on earth, Botswana. Botswana is huge. And it has the largest animal population of any country in Africa. More elephants than you can count, more giraffes, more hippopotami, more Nile crocodiles, more lions, more leopards, more warthogs, anything, spitting cobras, black mambas, deadly snakes, wonderful birds. And then after we go through Botswana, we will cut into that magnificent area that was once a Dutch colony, Cape Town. The Cape was taken over in a famous war where the British, anxious to take more away from others, took the Dutch colony at Cape Town and called it South Africa. South Africa is wonderful. Wonderful wine country, also has wonderful areas like Cape Town itself. It has islands off the coast, like Robben Island, where the great man himself was held prisoner. In the Boer War, lots of people fought, even the young Winston Churchill. But Churchill was on the wrong side. Once they took it away from the Dutch stayed. The Dutch are the Boers, or the Afrikaners. And when it became a part of the British Commonwealth, the Boers took over from within. Unfortunately, it was a tragic period because the Boers believed in apartheid, in separating the majority blacks from the minority whites and giving to the minority whites the privileges of top place. And so we'll look at that through the eyes of my cameraman. And I've been told by the young genius who works with me here, that's Sean, that it's doable, that I have this film. We can show it to you and I can talk with it. And I thought you might like to go on safari next week and meet every African animal you ever wanted to meet, from those wonderful South African penguins who swim up from Antarctica every year to a special beach where you can go down and visit with them. in their little tuxedo suits. They pay no attention to you. They just think you're the weirdest looking thing, and they think they're the normal. And they are quite wonderful. And I hope you will enjoy them. And if you think you won't, then of course you could read a book next Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock. Thank you very much for coming today.